Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order. Welcome to HPANWO TV. And we are now at Project Blue Book, episode 9. This is another review of the Project Blue Book series, series 2. And we're in the 9th episode now, the penultimate one. And it's called Broken Arrow. And this is very interesting. Now, I thought I'd heard that phrase before, Broken Arrow. I looked it up and it sort of gave me a clue about what the episode was going to be about, and indeed if you look it up you'll do the same. I should point out there will be spoilers in this particular review, as in all these reviews of Project Blue Book episodes, so if you are if you don't want that, then watch them first. This is primarily aimed at people who've already seen Project Blue Book. Well, this is more this is kind of a more season 1 style episode, I must say. Broken Arrow. The title starts at the beginning after the prologue. At the beginning there's always this little short segment that says previously on Project Blue Book, and the person who said, the narrator who says that is actually Gillen, Aidan Gillen, the actor who plays Hynek. And the titles then start, and the actual previous is mostly like to do with Susie, and it's basically covering mostly the previous episode, plus some shots from earlier on and even from season 1. Now, the term Broken Arrow refers to a nuclear weapon that gets lost. Bit of a tricky situation now. There's been a few actually events where this happens, because of course nuclear bombs are not the sort of thing you want to go missing. They could cause an awful lot of trouble. They could, well, firstly they could fall into the wrong hands. They could fall into the wrong hands of people who might want to wield them against your nation. I've got some dragon juice and I've got some coffee as well. And alternatively, they themselves pose a health risk, because the bombs contain plutonium, which is a highly toxic substance. It's probably the most poisonous substance on Earth. It could get into the environment, which could cause terrible damage in terms of radioactive toxicity, things like that. Now, it begins with this plane. Now the plane is a Russian plane. It's got like a red star on it from the Soviet Union, and it's flying over Canada, and there's these 2 pilots in it. But the odd thing is they speak perfect English, and I mean without an accent, which sort of comes up later on. Well, they're basically they head towards Canada from Russia, and they contact Canadian Air Traffic Control. Contacts them and says to them, you know, what you're doing here, you're invading our airspace. And the Canadian military, the Royal Canadian Air Force, are sort of monitoring them on radar. And then this UFO appears, big blue light comes towards them, and the 2 tracks merge on the radar scope, and then that's it. And they say the plane's crashed. The plane's crashed. Anyway, back on the farm, Hynek goes and visits Quinn. Captain Michael Quinn is he's in a bit of a state because he's drinking, and because he's been suspended because of what happened with Susie and everything like that in the previous episode. And so his house is in a bit of a state because the FBI have searched it, because it might be the KGB might put bugs in their listening devices and things like that, and they're not sure whether to trust Quinn again, whether he's under investigation obviously because he had a relationship with this woman, this KGB honey trap, and so they don't know what he's told her, things like that. So he's facing possible dishonourable discharge and everything from the US Air Force, being sacked, in other words, having his career ruined. So he's in that kind of state at the moment. So, but anyway, the reason Hynek goes to see him is because the Canadian authorities have contacted Project Blue Book because they don't have their own UFO project, and they say they've always been wanting to set one up. And I half expected Wilbert Smith to come into the programme, and he didn't, which was a bit of a disappointment. Because in fact Canada did have a UFO investigation project in the 1950s, which is when this is set. And there was a guy called Wilbert Smith was involved. Now he was kind of I think he was a radio engineer or something like that, but his story is really remarkable. I can't remember all the details, but I remember hearing about it. I think Andrew Johnson does a lecture about it. Very interesting chap indeed, if I remember rightly. I don't remember all the details, like I said. But anyway, in this scenario, Canada doesn't have an official UFO project, unlike the United States. It doesn't have its own equivalent of Project Blue Book in the setting, in the universe of the story. So they call Project Blue Book in, and then so Hynek persuades Quinn to come with him, even though Quinn is officially suspended. He says, well, what have we got to lose, and things like that. You know, come on, no one's... You see, the FBI have ripped his phone out, so... you see, no one can get hold of you, man. Look, your phone's broken. Of course, in those days, it was much easier because, you know, he's got a landline, and the FBI have, like, taken it apart to see if there's anything that Susie put in there to listen in on calls, like hidden microphones and things like that, and diversions and extra circuits. And, of course, literally, if someone did that nowadays... wouldn't make any difference, would it? Because they can get you in all other kinds of ways for other things. And so, but of course, in those days, it was different, wasn't it? It was very different. I was on the subject. Just got to remember to take my phone off the hook because I'm filming. Oh yeah. And so, literally, if his phone's not working, they don't know where he is. There's no CCTV they can follow him on. They can't bug his smartphone or anything like that because no one had smartphones. Amazing freedom people had back then. It's you know, I mean, I love modern technology. Of course, I'm using it right now. You know, but I think technology is a double-edged sword. Really, it has its disadvantages as well as its advantages. Anyway, that's we're going off topic there. So, as I said, Hynek and Quinn go up there to investigate, and they find out something weird, right? The UFO, because it's definitely some kind of blue light that attacked the plane. The plane, they say they picked up a transmission from the plane at 60,000 feet, which is too high for an aircraft to fly in those days. And they play this panicked radio message from the plane saying, "Mayday, Mayday! You know, there's a UFO. There's blue light coming at us. We can't change course." Things like that. And then it turns out that they're not the Canadians are not the only people who picked up the transmission. Anyway, to get to this location, which is quite remote because Canada's quite like there's a lot of remote areas in Canada, which is why Bigfoot lives there, of course. And so that doesn't come into the story, by the way. So Hynek and Quinn need to get there, and they need to get a seaplane, like one of these little small light aircraft with floats underneath. And Quinn flies it, and then there's this really amazing scene. There's where the plane is flying over this beautiful countryside. It's flying low because it's a light aircraft over this beautiful Canadian wilderness with trees and lakes, and it's a beautiful scenery in Canada. It's a beautiful place. And it reminds me of The Wicker Man, actually. You know, with the policeman with his seaplane. That's a good film if you've not seen it. And what's amusing is that you know, they Quinn and Hynek are like Quinn like says, "Here, take over controls," and so Hynek has to go to fly in the plane and things like that. And it's like a real kind of, there's a kind of what you call a bromance developing in that scene. They're really nice. Hey, we're a good team, aren't we, Doc? Says Quinn, and Hynek says, "Captain, you know, you're the kind of guy we need to investigate UFOs." There is a bromance, and to be honest, I mean the word bromance is a bit pejorative, isn't it? Because it's kind of used by feminists and by cultural Marxists of all kinds as it's a bit derogatory. It's like taking the mickey out of straight guys who get too fond of each other. You know, so if you have if you're like a heterosexual man and you have a really close friendship with another heterosexual man, it's kind of like, I suppose in today's politically correct society, it's frowned upon. It's seen as something. It's seen as something to ridicule. Do you know what I mean? Especially if you're white, it's seen as something not quite appropriate, and that's a shame. It's a real shame. But I think it's so I don't like to use the word bromance, but this is the kind of, there's a big bond developing between these two guys on Project Blue Book. And I talked about this in season 1. I said that there was a good kind of old cop, young cop dynamic between them. and of course it's not perfect. For example, in one of the episodes, the one with the Betty and Barney Hill type characters, the guy with the implant in the back of his neck, they get into a fight. They actually fight each other, and indeed they have like a tense moments where they often conflict, these two characters, over what to do. They often have a lot of conflict between them. And but you see this, like, they're so different. I mean, firstly, I mean, there's an age difference. I mean, Hynek is almost old enough to be Quinn's father. He's a good 20 years older. Quinn is this sort of like young Jack the Lad gung-ho Air Force pilot, you know, who sort of wears leather jackets and things like that. Hynek is this rather stuffy academic kind of character. He wears a grey suit. He has a beard. You know, he is almost like a classic kind of tenured professor. Very middle class. You kind of like, you can't quite imagine them having any kind of rapport, but they do. They're incredibly different from each other. Yeah, they do. And I think that just makes them more interesting as characters. Anyway, so they're sort of like, they're flying through this beautiful countryside, sort of smiling at each other and saying, you know, giving each other compliments and things like that. You know, and I'm sure everyone's folding their arms and going, oh, just book a room, guys, book a room, and all that sort of thing. But eventually they arrive at this remote logging community, and the guy who meets them because it's a seaplane, they have to land on water, so they tie up the boat. It comes up to a dock like a boat does. The guy who meets them looks like Trevor Murray of the Mindset podcast. If you've ever seen a picture of him, beard, sort of like you know, lumberjack shirt, quite big. You know, I suppose that's how you imagine a Canadian to be. And I don't know if they're taking the mickey out of Canadians, but his wife is kind of like, I suppose, what you imagine a typical Canadian woman to be, quite rugged, bulky, quite large, you know, slightly dirty hair, Wellington boots, carries a gun, things like that. Indeed, she saw the UFO. She was the principal witnesses because she was out hunting a wolf with her gun. I don't know if they're taking the mickey out of Canadians here, but and she looks up, she sees the plane flying over, this Russian plane, and this blue light approach it, and then the plane basically is like cut in half. And that's an interesting thing, because she says it, you see it, I mean, it's like a flashback and you see what she sees. And so they're kind of like going, and Quinn and Hynek go, let's go and see if we can find some survivors then. He says, survivors? Do you mean aliens? So they seem to be quite open to the idea of aliens. So Quinn and Hynek go off into the woods, and they eventually do find the remains of the plane. They find, first of all, a guy with a parachute, because he's parachuted out and he's one of the pilots. And they don't know who he is. I mean, it's all a bit mysterious, because he speaks English perfectly, with a standard kind of educated American accent. At the same time, Harding and Valentine are on their way up, because they've been tipped off by, they say, intelligence in the UK. So maybe the precursor of Nick Pope had been listening in on the airwaves and things like that, and they sent them on their way because they know that something weird is going on. So they find like burnt trees. They find the remains of the front half of the plane, because it's like the plane's cut in two. And this is what's interesting. They find the co-pilot who's still in the plane. He survives. And they only have minor injuries. And then the pilot pulls a gun on him. He pulls a pistol out of his jacket and levels it at Hynek and Quinn. And then he starts speaking. The weird thing is, like, I mean, this is a bit cheap, I suppose, but he then continues speaking in a strong Russian accent, which it seems a bit daft, because you see, he's obviously trained specially for this mission, and he speaks perfect English. So obviously he's like probably linked to intelligence or something, as well as being a pilot. Both of them speak perfect English, and by perfect English I mean like a native speaker, like I'm speaking it now, without a Russian accent. The moment their cover is blown, they start speaking like with strong Russian accents, you know. They start like they have this he start talking this stupid way, rather like Ayn Rand and things like that. Why? Why don't they just carry on speaking like they were speaking before? That's a bit daft, isn't it? But anyway, the reason this happens is because the plane is carrying a nuclear bomb and it's invaded Canadian airspace, and now it's crashed, hence Broken Arrow. So where the hell is this bomb? Now, it's hinted, because of the fact that the UFO cut the plane in half and only the front half has been seen. It's hinted, and I thought this was a part of it, that the UFO basically had taken the back half of the plane, including the nuke. And I think this is what the viewer is meant to think. Did it take it on purpose? Hynek at one point says, "Oh, are the UFOs protecting us from ourselves because of our use of nuclear weapons?" And that's an interesting concept, because of course it's well known that if the UFOs and the aliens exhibit a wide range of behaviours, they seem to have a lot of different agendas. Yet there's a few things you can glean from their behaviour, and one of those is their interest in nuclear weapons. Major UFO events often happen around nuclear weapons facility. I myself took the only UFO photo I've ever taken, I took near a nuclear weapons facility when I was hiking in Scotland years ago. So that's what I was wondering. Did the UFO attack the plane and take and like just dematerialise or capture the back half of it, because that's where the nuke was? I don't know, but this is what's hinted at. Anyway, they're a bit concerned because they're concerned that this bomb might detonate, which would devastate everything for 5 miles around. It must be a big bomb, like the Emperor bomb, this big bomb that they detonated, 50 megatons or something. The Russians detonated. I think it was around about 1960 they did that, and this is probably something similar. The Russians had bigger, more powerful bombs because their targeting wasn't so accurate, so they tended to have bombs with larger yield. Oh, so then they're concerned because obviously if a nuclear bomb detonates on Canadian soil, regardless of how it got there, what does that mean politically and diplomatically? How will the Soviets sort of say, "Oops, sorry, it was an accident"? Probably wouldn't. Probably no one would buy it. There'd probably be a retaliatory strike. And they say if it goes off, it's World War III. And then so they go looking for this bomb. Now it's interesting. What you have, this happened several times. It's the first time I've seen it in season 2, but it was a very common element of season 1, and that is they have this overhead shot, so the camera is like directly above what's going on, and below you can see like them walking through the woods. And there's 2 shots like this in this particular episode, and that's unusual. That was not done. I've not seen that done before in season 2, but it was very often that was done in season 1. I remember very often. So they're walking through the woods with these Russians, and they sort of like start getting on a bit better, talking about the war, flying in the war and stuff like that. It turns out that Quinn and this Russian co-pilot were both sort of they fought in the same, they sort of flew their planes in the same battle during World War II, things like that. Hynek starts talking to the other pilot about the Tunguska event. Now that's interesting. They bring up the Tunguska incident. Now this is something which there was a book written about it called The Fire Came By, and I read this book. There was an event in Russia in Tunguska, which is in a remote part of Siberia, in 1908, where a very large explosion took place. It was roughly 22 megatons, very big, bigger than most nuclear weapons. It devastated a huge area of forest. Because it was in such a remote area, it didn't actually kill anyone, but people saw it from miles around. It was reported in local newspapers, like 50 miles away. People saw a bright flash of light and they heard this booming noise. Now this has been considered to be, and it probably is actually, a near-Earth asteroid. It's actually a meteor strike, a very big one, probably 40 to 50 feet across, probably going at 10 plus miles per second that struck the Earth directly. If you know what I'm talking about, and I mean this is something I've studied in detail, and if you listen to HPANWO radio, you'll know that I regularly do space weather reports on every program for this reason, where I mention all the different near-Earth asteroids and things like that. So this thing went off in 1908. It's probably a near-Earth asteroid, but the guy who wrote this book, The Fire Came By, got this idea that it was some kind of alien spacecraft. And this is based on some of the eyewitness testimonies that said it changed course. It's not likely. I was quite impressed with this book when I read it, but I'm not so now. It probably was a comet or meteor impact. But there's nothing like, they didn't find any crater. It wasn't actually examined until the 1920s because Russia went through this political upheaval. But when the expedition arrived there, they didn't find any crater. It's like nothing hit the ground. It actually detonated in midair, blew apart in midair. Now this does happen with objects. They actually don't hit the ground. They blow up in the atmosphere when they hit they hit the air. So anyway, that's so Hynek is talking to this pilot about that. Anyway, they find a bomb. It's this big thing with fins on, like a contact fuse thing, and it has these fins, so it's designed to be dropped. It's like about 20 feet long, and they have to defuse it. And the pilot is like, he's also the technician. He's broken his hand. His hand's cut, and he's got it in a bandage. So who can do it now? Because it's diplomatic. They said first Quinn wants to do it, and they said we can't allow an American Air Force officer inside this bomb. And Hynek says, look, I'm a civilian, I'll do it. So Hynek, basically taking directions from the engineer, gets inside the bomb. He crawls inside this inspection casing, and he has to defuse the bomb. And it's a tense moment. He has to like fiddle with switches and pull things out. And they're saying you've got to be careful because if you touch that, it'll electrocute you. Oh dear. In the meantime, Valentine and Harding and the Canadians, they're out in the woods looking for this bomb for the pilots as well. Anyway, Hynek defuses the bomb the way he's described, but then the Russians pull a gun on him and say, we're going to kill you now because we've got to keep this secret, you know, and we're stuck in behind enemy territory. And Hynek pulls out what he believes is the nuclear core of this bomb. It's like this spherical lump of metal, which would be plutonium. They go, what are you doing holding that? It's it's plutonium, you know. Because if you really did that with plutonium, it would kill you. The radiation from it would kill you. But then it turns out it's a dud. And Hynek knew it was a dud because, firstly, there was no electricity at all running through this control panel, which he had to defuse. This place where he had to pull these wires out, because this is where they warned him he might get electrocuted. And secondly, he said that this core, this pit in this bomb, it was quite light, and he said plutonium would be 5 times heavier. So Hynek works out himself, because he's a scientist and he's trained and he knows chemistry and he knows physics and things like that, and he knows electricity. He works out the bomb is a dud. So everyone's just astonished. It's not even a real bomb, it's a fake bomb. And that's when it all comes out that basically those two pilots have been part of an experiment. They've been part of a psychological experiment by their own government, the Soviets. They were put on a plane and told to fly their plane with a nuclear bomb into Canadian airspace, rather like the Russians are doing nowadays with Britain. You know, they're coming close to British airspace and things like that. And then to fly back out again, not because they wanted to carry a real nuke into Canadian airspace, but they wanted to see how the pilots would respond if they thought a real nuke was on board. And yeah, so that's interesting. Now, I'm sure things like that really have been done. I'm sure it's probably likely that people are tested in that way with various things, just to see how they respond. And then the plane crashes. They hadn't expected it to crash, and it crashes, and they think there's a real bomb and stuff like that. Anyway, Harding and Valentine and the Canadians turn up. They arrest everyone and the pilots and things like that. And Harding and Valentine praised Project Blue Book. They're not angry anymore. In fact, they lift Quinn's suspension, They all go back to the office and they're going through their correspondence saying, oh, we got more UFO reports. A priest in Texas says this UFO was over his church, and you know, the usual sort of thing. And then it's like you think this is like the epilogue scene, and then John F. Kennedy comes to visit them. Senator John F. Kennedy, this is before he was president, and he walks in and he wants an urgent job done. He says because a US Navy ship in the North Atlantic has encountered a triangular craft. And Quinn says, what do you mean this thing came down from the sky? And Kennedy says, no, it came out from the water. So it's a USO, unidentified submerged object or submarine object. USOs are they're almost as common actually as UFOs. They're often seen, you know, UFOs, and very often it's the same thing. Like a UFO will go into the water or come out the water. Like Bill Cooper saw one, which is what inspired him to do his books. And also there's several other famous USO sightings. Christopher Columbus saw one on his expeditions, just a light coming in and out of the water. There's many other occasions where USOs have been detected. And I think the famous one is, the most famous one is actually another Canadian case, a real life Canadian case, the Shag Harbour incident. Don't laugh, that's just what it's called, Shag Harbour. I don't know how it got that name, but this was an incident where this USO was spotted in the water by fishermen, and the Royal Canadian Navy came and they investigated it and they couldn't catch it. Very interesting case indeed. So episode 9 was pretty exciting actually, pretty thrilling, very interesting. What I found interesting about this particular episode is the UFO element was really not a big part of it. It was almost periphery to the story. The only role UFOs play in this particular episode is they caused the crash of the plane. They caused the crash of the plane. It turns out they didn't take the nuclear bomb. They cut the plane in half, but if they took the back half, they obviously dropped the nuke on the way. Maybe aliens aren't infallible, but that's not really ever discussed in the program. The UFO issue is really just the cause of the crash. The main plot device, the main plot line, the main story, is Project Blue Book looking for this bomb, finding it, and all the other things that go with it. So it's not really a UFO themed story, apart from, like I say, the UFO causing the plane crash. At the end, when Kennedy comes in, he's obviously setting up the scene. This often happens in season 2, more so than season 1. The final scene, the final scene of one episode will set up the next one. As I said, season 2 is much more like a serial, instead of different episodes having independent stories. Much more so than season 1, even though in season 1 there was like a narrative arc that covered the entire series. Episode 10 is called Operation Mainbrace, so I can kind of guess where it's going to go here, because I'm familiar with the real Operation Mainbrace. I've heard of it. But it's an exciting episode. I enjoyed it very much indeed. So well, it's just one more to go, isn't there? So best thing to do is review the final episode of Project Blue Book, and then that's it. So thank you all of you for watching HPANWO TV. Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order.